When you hear Frank Ocean, your first thought can be many things. Your mind may immediately jump to his iconic album Blonde that established him as one of the greatest artists of our generation. Perhaps you think back to some of his amazing live performances, and also some of his more controversial ones too.
Guys, I'm being told it's curfew, so that's the end of the show.
Or maybe you think about the various merchandise he releases every now and again that we all know deep down are cash grabs, yet still end up selling out within moments of their release. But the one thing I bet you don't think of when you hear Frank Ocean is Chipotle. But alas, Chipotle and Frank Ocean have a very unique relationship, one that even the biggest Frank Ocean stans and diehards don't know about. It involves Frank, obviously, Chipotle, obviously, over $200,000, and weirdly enough, the singer Fiona Apple. No, Frank Ocean didn't cater Fiona Apple's birthday. It's a little more complex than that. This story that I'm going to tell in this video showed us early on in Frank's career what kind of character he really is. Frank is rarely seen in the public eye, and whenever we do get any glimpse of him, it's all over the internet. But this story alone tells us so much about who Frank is, and it went completely under the radar, totally unnoticed. Yet it is one of the biggest indications that show us how Frank, one of the most adored artists in the world, is actually just a flawed human being like every one of us. Before going into the Chipotle story, I want to talk about the tipping point that Frank had with his fans. This is the point where fans kind of lost a lot of respect for Frank, and that was in 2023 during his Coachella performance. After giving an underwhelming headlining performance during weekend one, which Frank also demanded not to be live streamed for fans at home to watch, he would then proceed to drop out of the festival right before weekend two kicked off. Up to this point, Frank had really been testing the loyalty of his fan base. His last project was released 7 years ago, and he hadn't released any piece of music for 3 years. To fans, it was starting to look like Frank was just taking advantage of their admiration for him. He'd released low-quality merchandise at unreasonably high prices, which his fans would no doubt buy and wouldn't ship until months or even at times years later. He'd set out to perform at festivals like Primavera and FYF Fest, only to back out days before after fans had already traveled all the way to see him. And the worst part about all of this is it seemed like Frank had no remorse for his actions. When it did come out that he was going to be headlining Coachella, fans went crazy. Weekends 1 and 2 sold out instantly, but reality came crashing back down for those same fans.
Can't you see what's happened?
At weekend 1, he came out late, performed for a little over an hour, which mostly was playing the music and walking around, and then the next day announced he was dropping out for weekend 2. It later came out that Frank had for his set an ice skating rink with skaters all trained on a specific choreography.
Like, those figure skaters got cut, not because there was an ice issue, not because something went wrong, there was no malfunction. He just straight up was like, fuck this. I'm not doing this.
Only to cancel his hours before his set, having the rink melted down and the skaters relieved of their duties. It also came out that Frank apparently sprained his ankle right before the weekend 1 set, and that's why he dropped out of weekend 2, which he was contractually able to because he had a doctor's note. Well, this was the final straw for so many fans. No music in 3 years, no album or performances in 7 years, and those who came to see him for weekend 2 were shit out of luck. But really, the signs leading up to Frank's fallout with his fans were always there. These red flags existed all the way back in 2013. That was the year that Frank Ocean and Chipotle agreed to go into business together. It was 2013. Frank had dropped his debut album Channel Orange less than a year ago and won a Grammy for it just a few months back. Now it was July and touring for the album was nearly complete. But still, his name was huge at this point, and with it came plentiful opportunities outside of touring. Well, one of those opportunities came in the form of an email to Frank's manager. It was from Chipotle's marketing team. That email read, "This letter constitutes an offer of the material terms of the agreement entered into between Chipotle Mexican Grill and Frank Ocean for artists to record a lyrically faithful version of the song entitled Pure Imagination for use solely in synchronization with the short form music video currently entitled The Scarecrow." So the ask from Chipotle was for Frank Ocean to do a cover of the song Pure Imagination, which is from the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
With a spin, traveling in the world of my creation.
And this would be featured in a short-form music video titled The Scarecrow. Chipotle met with Frank and showed him the video that his cover would be featured on. The video itself shows a scarecrow going to work at Crow Foods Incorporated, a big corporation in this made-up world. At Crow Foods, that scarecrow witnesses the crow robots pumping the chickens with GMOs, as well as cows hooked up to machines to pump their milk. At the end, the scarecrow goes back home, and after finding a fresh pepper growing in his garden, decides to go back downtown and produce his own food, which is all locally sourced from his garden. The video is great. It pushes the agenda that factory farming is bad and locally sourced farming is good. But the brand behind it, Chipotle, is a giant corporation. Maybe not as bad as Crow Foods, but still, it's not like they're saving these adorable cows or chickens from being slaughtered. However, the overall message, although coming from a giant corporation, is still a good one. And on top of that, Chipotle had none of their branding on it, which they told Frank was intentional. So given this, Frank was on board. Next, the contract came in. It said Chipotle would pay all costs for recording up to $25,000. $12,500 now, and the other half when completed. Then they would compensate Frank $400,000 for the whole project. Again, half of it now, and the other $200,000 once it's completed. However, the contract also stipulated, and I quote, "In the event that artist does not deliver a master reasonably satisfactory to Chipotle by the delivery date," which was August 7th, then Chipotle may terminate this agreement, and Chipotle shall be discharged of any further obligation to compensate artists, while artists shall remit to Chipotle all amounts paid to artists for his services. Great. Frank then signed the contract. Chipotle then wired over $212,500 to Frank. Well, Frank, being who he is, waited until August 7th, the last day of the agreed upon deadline, to go into the studio and record his cover of Pure Imagination. When he got to the studio, his team played him the final version of the video Scarecrow. Everything was great, except the last 2 seconds. Really quick, if you are enjoying this video, the only thing I ask is to please like it and throw us a sub. Tofu Media is run by myself, Mac, and my friend Josh, so any support we can get means the world. Alright, now back to the video. Everything was great, except the last 2 seconds. In the last 2 seconds, this happens. Chipotle's branding. Frank Ocean refused to record the cover and walked out of the studio. Chipotle didn't hear anything and still didn't have the recording they were promised by August 7th. So on the 8th, they emailed Frank's team. Nothing. On the 9th, they emailed Frank's team. Nothing. Well, Chipotle got fleeced. They gave Frank $212,500 and got nothing in return. Finally, almost a week after their emails to Frank, they got a reply. It read, "When Frank was asked to participate in this project, Chipotle's representatives told him that the thrust of the campaign was to promote responsible farming. There was no Chipotle reference or log in the initial presentation, and Chipotle told Frank that was an intentional element of the campaign. Frank was also promised that he'd have the right to approve the master and all advertising, promotional, and publicity materials, and that was incorporated into the agreement Frank signed with Chipotle. Chipotle materially breached the agreement when it refused to permit Frank to approve the music for the ad and when it refused to remove the Chipotle logo from the ad. At that point, Frank had the right to terminate the agreement, which he exercised. So Frank planned to keep the money that was given to him. Well, Chipotle was not down for that, so they sued.
Chipotle is suing Grammy Award-winning R&B artist Frank Ocean after he backed out of a commercial deal. TMZ reports Mexican food chain Chipotle hired Ocean and a $425,000...
Fast forward months later to March 7th. The court papers are delivered. Well, it's pretty obvious from the contract that Frank and Chipotle agreed on that Frank does in fact have no chance of winning this thing. Everything that was outlined in that email they sent was just hearsay and not actually in any of the writing. So he would in fact have to pay back the $212,500 Chipotle gave him. And that he did. On March 10th, 3 days later, Frank would post this on his Tumblr. A cashier's check for that amount, and in the memo, off. And right before this post, he'd post a link to the Wikipedia page for defamation, which in there reads, "Defamation is a communication that injures a third party's reputation and causes a legally redressable injury." So clearly Frank was salty. Chipotle's response? Well, they told Rolling Stone, when we get a check from Frank, we should be able to close the books on this. Right now, all we have is a photo online. 10 days later, Chipotle dropped the lawsuit and told Rolling Stone, yes, he sent a check, but unlike the pics he posted online, it didn't say fuck off on the memo line. Well, Chipotle ended up getting Fiona Apple to replace Frank Ocean on the commercial, and it actually turned out really well.
We'll begin with the spin, traveling in a world of my creation. What explanation.
The Scarecrow short generally had a positive reception and actually did win some awards. This Chipotle incident is really the only time Frank hasn't had his way. Well, that and the time he did a rendition of Hotel California and the Eagles filed a cease and desist. But aside from these two incidents, Frank has finessed so many situations and always takes the dub. A perfect example of this is when he fleeced Def Jam back in 2016, which was his label at that time. The story goes that he had one more project left in his contract with Def Jam until he was independent. So to get out of his contract, he dropped Endless, the visual album. But then, not even 24 hours later, he dropped Blonde, completely independently, which meant he kept all the money and didn't split it with anyone. At the time when fans and just generally people found out about this story, people thought, hell yeah, Frank is sticking it to the man. But as time has passed, we're starting to see Frank's true colors get exposed. It wasn't ever really about sticking it to the man. Really, Frank was just looking out for his best interests, which I can't blame him for doing. However, when it started leaking into his relationship with his fans is when Frank's character started to sour for me personally, and his fans started to catch on. First, it was the merch he'd release. Fans would buy it, it'd take forever to ship out, and when it did, often it'd come completely damaged. The next slap in the face is when he'd release his jewelry line, Homer, where, as if he were trolling his fans, he'd release a gold cock ring costing more than $25,000. And finally, the Coachella disaster. Getting fans to buy tickets to the festival, performing the first weekend haphazardly, refusing Coachella the ability to live stream it, and then pulling out before weekend 2. Now, looking back at some of the past things Frank did that we thought was cool, we're starting to see it in a different light given all these things. This Chipotle situation, for example, it makes Frank just seem like a brat, and not in the cool Charlie XCX way. I mean, I don't understand why Frank thinks that he can just keep the money that the company gave him. He didn't deliver what he said he would, and therefore he doesn't keep the money. Simple as that. Sure, maybe Chipotle deceived him a bit and alluded to the idea that they wouldn't brand any of the video to be associated with Chipotle, so once Frank did see that, he felt cheated, but it seems like Frank feels like he's entitled to that money, which is just shitty. With all that being said though, with this story, I do respect his authenticity, in that he didn't go through with the campaign, even with $400,000 looking at him, just because of this branding issue. So yes, I applaud Frank for sticking to his morals, but outside of that, I can't help but think that Frank is very selfish, doesn't care about his fans, and more so just takes advantage of them. I mean, anytime he starts what looks to be a potential rollout for new music, it just usually ends up being another merch drop, and fans seem to always buy it. But lately, it seems less so. After the Coachella disaster, the tide seemed to shift a bit. Now his cult fan base is starting to break down, and many are leaving behind the artists they once adored so much. And this is actually a good thing if people want more music. By not glorifying Frank or buying his stuff, he has to then put out more music, which is pretty ironic. If you watched all the way to here, you're the best. If you don't already, please throw us a subscribe. We drop a video every week. And please let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. You're the best. Thanks for watching.